Good morning, boys. Now let us continue with the next chapter. The next chapter is chapter number 11, that is the fluvial process and associated landforms. Now, whenever you hear a word fluvial, just remember it's water. Means that whenever the water is being carried down by the river, it flows from one area to another area. It results in the formation of different types of landforms. Yeah. So because of that, fluvial process and associated landforms, this chapter is there in your textbook. Now, before we begin, there are few topics or there are few particular points which I would like to discuss before I continue with the thorough chapter. The first is the source of the river. Now, the source of the river means the place of origin, because a river needs to have a source, therefore it will flow throughout the year. For example, if you look at this river Tista, now if you look at river Ganga, now it has its source in Gangotri, where there is plenty of glaciers are there, and the glacier keeps on melting, which keeps on providing water, resulting the river to flow throughout the year. Next is mouth. The mouth of the river means when the river enters the sea or the ocean. It means that particular point where the river meets the sea or the ocean, that point is called as a mouth of the river. Next, catchment area. Now, catchment area means the area from where the river gets water. For example, whenever the rainfall takes place in Kalimpong, the rainwater, it flows down the slope and it reaches either river Tista or either it reaches Reli river. So the Kalimpong became the catchment area for the river Tista and for the river Reli. So because of that, catchment area is very, very important, especially for a river to grow as well as to prosper. Now, there are three different types of streams. Then these streams are very, very important. First is consequent stream. Now, consequent stream means those stream which follows the general slope of the land. It means that the water always flows from higher elevation towards the lower elevation. So whenever the water flows from higher elevation towards the lower elevation, and if that water follows the general slope of the land, that stream is called as consequent stream. Next is subsequent stream. Now, subsequent stream means those tributary joining the main river. For example, if you look at this river Reli, it joins river Tista near 29th mile, or we can say 29 mile, especially out here, that is very, very famous. Now, this Reli river, when it joins the Tista river, this Reli river can be called as a subsequent stream. Next, insequent stream. Now, insequent stream means when the river flows adjusting the relief feature of the land. It means that sometimes the relief feature may be uneven, sometimes there may be a depression, or sometimes there may be a rise in the landform. So when the river flows adjusting the relief feature, those rivers are called as insequent stream. Next, base level. Now, base level. I think this word is very, very common, because especially whenever you look at the map or whenever you look at the height of this Mount Everest, the present height of the Mount Everest is 8,850 meters. Now, this height of the Mount Everest is measured from the sea level. Why it is measured from the sea level? Because the sea level is the deepest portion on the Earth's surface where further erosion is not possible. Therefore, base level means the lowest level where the river can erode. where the river can erode. It means further beyond the base level, the river cannot erode. It means that particular point, when the particular base level is being reached or being attained by the river, those areas is called as the base level. Therefore, sea level is considered as a base level. It means that beneath the sea level, there is no possibilities for further erosion. Means that further deepening of the sea. Now let us continue with this chapter. First, process of erosion by river. Now, whenever the erosion has been done by the river, it is been done by three different processes. The first is hydraulic action. Now, hydraulic action means whenever a river flows, the river has its own velocity, and this velocity and the pressure of the river, whenever it exerts pressure over the river beds and the banks, it results in the erosion of the adjoining banks or the adjoining bed of the river. Because what happens, especially during the rainy season, when the velocity of the river is high, in that particular moment, whenever the water waves, it strikes at the base or it strikes at the bed, these water waves, it has a velocity, and these velocity, whenever it strikes on the bed, it exerts pressure, and whenever it gives pressure to the bedrocks, those bedrocks, it starts to erode. But if you look at these features, now these features, it takes hundred of years for the formation. It means that the erosion, the weathering by the river and the erosion by the river, as not only by river, by the other agent of erosion, it takes hundred of years which we can see very easily. Next, abrasion. When the rock particles brought by the river strike against the exposed bedrocks, now what happens? Now see, whenever the river flows, whenever the water flows, this water, it carries plenty of smaller stones. And these smaller stones, when it strikes at the exposed bedrocks, or when it strikes at the exposed bank of the river, those banks of the river gets further eroded, and that erosion by the sediments brought down by the river is called as a abrasion. And not only that, those smaller pebbles, as the river carries them from a very far area and it takes it down to the plains. So by the time it reaches the plain, these smaller pebbles or smaller stones, it strikes among each other. When they strike among each other, even their own sizes gets reduced. That is called as a abrasion. Next, solution. Now, solution means dissolving of soluble minerals. Now, if you look at it especially, there are many different types of minerals which are soluble in water. So, as the river comes in contact with the soluble minerals get dissolved in the water and resulting those areas to be eroded. For example, salt. Salt is a soluble mineral. Now, next, types of erosion. Now, in terms of types of erosion, there are three types of erosion. First one is the headward erosion. Now, headward erosion means process of cutting the relief feature to form its path. It means that headward erosion means to make a path, to make a permanent path for the river to flow entirely throughout its life. Clear? That is called as a headward erosion. One of the best example of the headward erosion is the gully erosion. Now, after the gully erosion comes into existence, and if the water keeps on flowing on that eroded part of the land, it results in the formation of headward erosion and in the formation of a new course of a river. Next, vertical erosion. Now vertical erosion comes into existence especially in the hills, because in the hills what happens, the velocity of the water is very high. So as the velocity of the water is very high, it results in higher down cutting by the river vertically. So as the river starts eroding, the base layer, the base of the river, it results in the vertical erosion. And when the vertical erosion takes place, it results in the formation of gorge, it results in the formation of a I-shaped valley. Lateral erosion. Lateral erosion means when the sides of the river is widened. It means that the sides, the banks of the river gets wider and wider. Now why? The reason is that when the sides of the river gets much more wider, it results the course of the river to be much more wider. Now if you look at this river Brahmaputra, the Brahmaputra has the widest width in terms of the river in India. It has the width of the river Brahmaputra is around 1 kilometer or more than 1000 meters. Next, factors affecting erosional work of the river. Now what are the factors which affects the erosional work of river? First is velocity of water. Now velocity means the speed of the water. If the velocity or the speed of the water is high, its erosional work is also very high. It means that it can carry any obstruction which comes along its path. As it can carry any obstruction or any types of rocks, bigger rocks, smaller rocks, whenever these rocks is being carried away, it results in higher erosion work done by the river. Now this erosion work by velocity of water is especially found in the hills, because in the hills we have steeper slopes. As the slopes is much more steeper, the velocity of the water increases. The velocity of the water increases, resulting more erosional work of river in the hills than in the plains, because in the plains they have a gentle slope. As they have a gentle slope, the speed of the river is very less. Next, volume of water. Now the volume means the quantity of water. Now volume of water is also one of the major factors which affects the erosional work of the river. If the volume of water is high, it means that it can carry bigger boulders. It can carry big boulders, and these boulders, it acts as a tool of erosion on its path. So these smaller rocks, bigger rocks, when they collide against the exposed bedrocks, those bedrocks as well as the banks of the river gets further eroded, resulting volume of water is also one of the major part of the erosional work. Because if the volume of water is more, it means that it can carry more load than the volume of water. Nature of rocks. If the rocks is soft in nature, those rocks can be eroded very easily. If the rocks is hard in nature, those rocks are eroded, but it takes longer period of time for its complete erosion. So because of that, nature of rock also determines the erosional work of a river. Next, load of river. Now the load of river is a very important tool because it acts as a cutting tool for river. Because I've already told you, because when they carry huge load, for example in the form of rocks, in the form of smaller pebbles, in the form of sand, these acts as a cutting tool, because when these sediments it strikes upon the exposed rocks, those exposed rocks gets further eroded. So because of that, load of the river is very important for the erosional work of a river. Next, transportation work of a river. Now if you look at here, especially in terms of river, River has three different functions. First is transportation, clear? As it transports different types of sediments, these sediments, it acts as a cutting tool. It acts as a cutting tool for the erosion. And when the erosion is been done, those material is been further transported. It has been further transported by the river, depending upon its size and its weight. If it is much more lighter, then these sediments is been further carried away towards the plain. If the sediments is much more bigger, much more heavier, then it is been left at the foothills. Foothills means the place where the hill meets the plains. So it is even left especially at the foothill. So because of that, transportation work of the river, first traction. Now, especially whenever you go towards the Siliguri, you will find on the banks of the river Tista that there are big boulders of rocks. Now, how is it possible for that a volume of rock to bring such a big boulders? Now, those boulders of rock is been brought down by the river Tista through the process of traction. Because traction means the dragging down. Because traction means when the big boulders are being dragged down by the river, means the volume, the velocity of the river drags down the bigger rocks from the higher elevation towards the lower elevation. So those agents which are responsible for dragging the big boulder from one place to another place is called as a traction. Next, saltation. Saltation means that when smaller pieces of rocks has been transported from one place to another place, the river or the volume of water cannot carry those smaller boulders. So as they are not able to be carried by the rivers, these smaller boulders, they keep on jumping on the floor. They keep on jumping like in the form of frog, and finally they are being transported from one place to another place. And the movement of medium-sized rock medium-sized rock by the rivers from one place to another in the form of frog jumping is called as a saltation. Next is solution. Again the same thing. Solution means those minerals which are soluble in water. So when those minerals which get dissolved in water gets finally transported from one place to another place, and those areas are further eroded as those minerals gets dissolved in the water. Next, suspension. Now suspension means those fine particles like the sand, the clay, the silt. Now these are the very finest particles which are very, very light in nature. As they are very light in nature, the river water can easily carry them over to a long distance. As they have been able to carry through a long distance, they keep on floating. They keep on floating on the water, and finally they have been transported especially towards the mouth of the river, and the transportation of fine particles is called as a suspension.